This is not how empires announce their weakness. Most people think Donald Trump won. He killed the supreme leader. He struck Tehran. He sent the world's most powerful military into Iran with one clear message. American dominance is absolute. The headlines will say he destroyed the regime. The analysts will debate whether this is Iraq 2003 all over again. And while the world watches explosions in Tehran, something far more structural just happened in the Strait of Hormuz, something that will reshape global energy markets for the next 30 years, something Trump cannot reverse with missiles or sanctions or threats. Iran closed the strait, not temporarily, not symbolically. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps broadcast on open frequencies. No vessel is permitted to pass. Insurance companies pulled coverage within hours. Shipping giants rerouted their fleets. And 20% of the world's oil supply, 21 million barrels per day, $500 billion in annual energy trade, stopped moving through the narrow waterway between Iran and Oman. Trump thought killing Khamenei would break Iranian resolve. Instead, it gave Tehran the justification to deploy the one weapon America cannot counter: geography. The Strait of Hormuz is 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. The shipping lanes are 3 kilometers in each direction. 100% of that corridor sits within Iranian and Omani territorial waters under international law. Iran does not need to physically blockade it. They just need to make transit uninsurable, declare it a war zone, deploy naval mines, station anti-ship missiles on the 3 islands they control at the entrance, fire a few warning shots at commercial tankers, and the entire global shipping industry stops using it voluntarily because no corporation will risk a $200 million vessel and crew in an active conflict zone, where insurance premiums just hit 6-year highs. And that is exactly what happened. Within 72 hours of the US-Israeli strikes, Hormuz became a de facto no-go zone for international commerce. Iranian and Chinese flagged ships still transit, a few Russian vessels. But the massive crude carriers that move Gulf oil to Asian refineries, the LNG tankers supplying energy to Europe, the container ships connecting Middle Eastern ports to global supply chains, all of them rerouted or anchored in safe waters waiting for the crisis to pass. Except the crisis is not passing, because Iran is not backing down. And the longer Hormuz remains restricted, the more permanent the economic damage becomes. Here is what Trump did not anticipate. Closing Hormuz does not hurt Iran as much as it devastates everyone who depends on Gulf energy. Saudi Arabia exports 7 million barrels per day through the strait. The UAE, 3 million? Kuwait, Iraq, Qatar, all of them rely on Hormuz to reach global markets. Iran exports less than 2 million barrels daily, and most of that goes to China through sanctions evading tanker networks that do not care about insurance or international shipping norms. So when Iran closes Hormuz, they lose a fraction of their export capacity. But US allies in the Gulf, the ones Trump claims he is defending, lose nearly everything. And the countries that depend on those exports, China, India, Japan, South Korea, they face immediate energy supply crises that force them to find alternatives. Alternatives that do not involve the United States. China is the world's largest crude importer, 14 million barrels per day. Half of that traditionally came through the Strait of Hormuz from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq, and Iran. When Hormuz closed, Chinese refiners had 3 options: drain strategic reserves and hope the crisis resolves quickly, cut refining output and trigger domestic fuel shortages and economic slowdown, or pivot immediately to alternative suppliers who can deliver volume without transiting a war zone. They chose option 3, and the only supplier with the capacity, infrastructure, and willingness to fill a multi-million barrel per day gap on short notice is Russia. Russia was already exporting record volumes to China, over 2 million barrels per day of crude via pipeline and seaborne routes that bypass both Hormuz and any Western-controlled choke point. The Eastern Siberia-Pacific Ocean pipeline runs directly from Russian oil fields to northern China. Russian tankers move additional barrels from Pacific ports. None of it requires insurance from London or transit through contested waters. And critically, Russia has spare capacity because Western sanctions forced them to redirect exports away from Europe and toward Asia over the past 2 years. China was moderating its Russian intake in late 2025, trying to maintain some diversification and avoid over-reliance on Moscow. The Hormuz closure eliminated that restraint overnight. Within days of the U.S. strikes on Iran, commodity tracking data showed Chinese independent refiners, the so-called teapot refiners in Shandong province, increasing Russian crude purchases by over 200,000 barrels per day. These refiners account for 20% of China's total refining capacity. They were the largest buyers of discounted Iranian crude. Now they cannot get Iranian barrels because Hormuz is closed and U.S. secondary sanctions make any remaining Iranian shipments too risky under wartime conditions. So they turn to Russia, which is offering similar discounts, $10 to $11 per barrel below benchmark pricing, and delivering through routes that have zero exposure to U.S. military operations or Middle Eastern instability. India faces an even more acute crisis. 50% of India's crude imports transit the Strait of Hormuz. That is nearly 2.6 million barrels per day from Gulf suppliers. India has activated emergency protocols, drawing down strategic petroleum reserves, but those reserves cover maybe 10 days of consumption at current rates. India cannot wait for diplomacy to reopen Hormuz. They need oil now, and the only source that can provide the volume India requires without involving the strait is Russia. India and Russia already have established energy trade relationships built during the Ukraine war, when India became one of the largest buyers of Russian crude that Europe stopped purchasing. Those networks reactivate immediately under crisis conditions. And unlike the United States, Russia does not lecture India about which oil they are allowed to buy or impose secondary sanctions for trading with the wrong supplier. This is the structural shift Trump missed. The Hormuz closure is not temporary leverage. Iran will surrender once the bombing stops. It is a permanent reordering of energy dependency. Chinese refiners who switch to Russian crude and discover the logistics work reliably do not switch back just because Hormuz eventually reopens. Indian importers who build supply chains around Russian pipelines and Arctic routes do not abandon those investments the moment Saudi tankers can transit the strait again. Energy infrastructure decisions are made on 10 to 20-year time horizons. Once a major importer redirects its supply chains, the redirection becomes structural, and that structural shift directly benefits Russia while eroding U.S. influence over global energy markets. Russia is making a fortune. Not because they are fighting in Iran, they are not. Not because they are particularly clever strategically. They are just geographically positioned to benefit when Middle Eastern energy becomes inaccessible. Russian oil does not transit Hormuz. Russian gas exports to China move through pipelines that bypass the Middle East entirely. And Russian willingness to sell energy without political conditions or moral lectures makes them the default alternative the moment U.S.-aligned suppliers become unreliable or unreachable. When Trump attacked Iran, he handed Russia the greatest economic gift Moscow has received since Europe panicked over Ukraine and paid premium prices for LNG to replace Russian pipeline gas. Commodity analysts estimate that if Hormuz remains restricted for more than 2 weeks, Russia will capture an additional $400 to $600 billion in long-term energy contracts as Asian buyers lock in alternative supply. That is not revenue from higher prices. That is market share permanently transferred from Gulf producers to Russian exporters because the infrastructure and relationships get built during the crisis and persist after it. This is exactly what happened during the Ukraine war. Europe cut Russian gas, prices spiked, and within 18 months, Russia had redirected those volumes to Asia at slightly lower prices, but with long-term commitments that replaced what they lost in Europe. Now the same dynamic is playing out with oil. Trump closes Hormuz by attacking Iran. Asian buyers panic. Russia offers volume. Contracts get signed. And 5 years from now, when the war is over and Hormuz is open, those contracts are still in force, and Russian energy dominance in Asia is locked in. Here is what makes this particularly devastating for U.S. strategy. America does not export enough oil or LNG to replace what China and India are losing from the Gulf. The United States produces 13 million barrels of crude per day. Most of that is consumed domestically or exported to nearby markets like Canada and Mexico. U.S. LNG exports are growing, but still represent a fraction of what Qatar and other Gulf states supply to Asia. So when Hormuz closes, the United States cannot step in as an alternative supplier at the scale required. They can offer symbolic shipments, maybe a few 100,000 barrels per day, but nothing close to the multi-million barrel gap that Asian economies need, filled immediately. Russia can. Russia has the volume, the infrastructure, and the willingness to sell without conditions. And China and India, who are already frustrated with U.S. tariffs, sanctions, and political pressure, have zero hesitation about deepening energy dependence on Moscow if it keeps their economies running. Trump wanted to demonstrate that American military power can reshape the Middle East, and he succeeded in proving that American missiles can kill Iranian leaders and destroy military infrastructure. But he simultaneously demonstrated that American power cannot control global energy flows when geography and necessity override political alignment. Iran does not need to defeat the U.S. military. They just need to make the strait unusable, long enough for alternative supply chains to solidify. And every day Hormuz remains closed is another day Chinese and Indian refiners build deeper relationships with Russian exporters. Another day new contracts get signed. Another day the post-Hormuz energy map becomes more entrenched. The broader economic consequences are catastrophic. Oil prices spiked immediately after the Hormuz closure. Brent crude hit levels not seen since the initial Ukraine war panic. But this time, the spike is not driven by speculation about potential disruption. It is driven by actual supply shortages as 20% of globally traded oil stops moving. Refiners cannot get feedstock. Prices rise, fuel costs increase, inflation accelerates, and because oil is traded globally, even countries that do not import through Hormuz feel the price impact. American consumers see gas prices climb. European industries face higher energy input costs. Developing economies that depend on fuel imports watch their trade deficits explode as they pay premium prices for scarce supply. The International Crisis Group warned that closure of Hormuz would trigger a global recession within weeks, not months, weeks, because modern economies cannot absorb a 20% supply shock in their primary energy source without massive disruption. Factories cut production, transportation costs soar, supply chains that depend on predictable fuel prices collapse. Central banks face impossible choices between raising interest rates to fight inflation or cutting rates to prevent recession. And all of this economic chaos benefits Russia, which is selling oil at elevated prices to buyers who have no alternatives, while the United States and its allies absorb the economic damage of a war Trump started without understanding the second-order effects. Trump's entire strategy rested on the assumption that overwhelming military force would compel Iranian surrender, destroy their leadership, eliminate their nuclear program, degrade their military capability, and Iran, faced with American power, would capitulate. Except Iran is not capitulating. They are deploying asymmetric leverage. They cannot match U.S. aircraft carriers or stealth bombers, but they can make 33 kilometers of water unusable for global commerce. They can turn geography into a weapon that costs the United States and its allies hundreds of billions in economic damage, while costing Iran relatively little because their economy is already isolated and sanctioned and barely dependent on international energy markets. This is the lesson Trump refuses to learn. Military dominance does not translate into economic control when adversaries have geographic leverage and the willingness to use it. The United States can destroy Iranian military assets. They cannot force tankers through a contested waterway. They cannot make insurance companies cover war zone risks. They cannot prevent China and India from buying Russian oil when Gulf supplies are inaccessible. They cannot reverse the structural energy realignment that is happening in real time as Hormuz remains closed and alternatives become permanent. Allies are panicking. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are watching their export revenues collapse because they cannot move oil through Hormuz, and their pipeline alternatives, the East-West pipeline in Saudi Arabia and the Fujairah route in the UAE, have limited capacity and cannot handle the volume that normally transits the strait. Japan and South Korea are facing energy emergencies because they import 60 to 70% of their oil through Hormuz and have minimal strategic reserves compared to their consumption rates. European allies are warning that prolonged Hormuz closure will spike their energy costs and trigger recessions, just as they are recovering from the Ukraine war economic shock. And none of them can do anything except wait for Trump to negotiate an end to a war he started without securing their energy supplies first. This is American credibility eroding in real time. U.S. allies in Asia and Europe are learning that American military action in the Middle East can directly threaten their economic security and that Washington either does not care or did not plan for the consequences. That lesson will persist long after this war ends. The next time the United States asks Japan or South Korea or Germany to support American policy in the Middle East, those governments will remember that Trump closed Hormuz, spiked their energy costs, and handed Russia the contracts that should have gone to U.S.-aligned Gulf producers. And they will be far more hesitant to follow American leadership. Meanwhile, Russia and China are coordinating. The Maritime Security Belt 2026 exercise, joint naval drills between Russian, Chinese, and Iranian forces in the Strait of Hormuz, continued, even as U.S. strikes hit Tehran. Russian and Chinese warships operating in the strait during an American military operation sends an unmistakable message. Moscow and Beijing are signaling that they view Hormuz as strategically important, and that they will maintain presence regardless of U.S. military action. That presence complicates any American effort to forcibly reopen the strait, because U.S. naval forces would have to operate in proximity to Russian and Chinese vessels, creating escalation risks that go far beyond Iran. This is the new reality Trump created. He killed Khamenei. He struck Iranian nuclear facilities. He demonstrated American willingness to use force, and in exchange, he triggered a $500 billion energy crisis that benefits Russia, undermines U.S. allies, and proves that American military power cannot control the global economy when adversaries have geographic leverage and great power rivals offer alternatives. The war is not over. The strikes continue. But the strategic outcome is already clear. Trump won the battle. Russia won the war. And the Strait of Hormuz, that narrow waterway most people could not find on a map last month, just became the place where American dominance quietly ended and multipolarity became the new normal. Khamenei is dead, Iran is being bombed, and China is buying Russian oil. That is not the victory Trump promised. That is the unintended consequence he cannot reverse. History does not care about military superiority when economic necessity drives nations toward alternatives. And the necessity created by closing Hormuz just locked in a decade of Russian energy dominance in Asia that no amount of American firepower can undo.